As we all know that the Bible is divided into two testaments, the Old and the New. And of lately we see that people or many teachers or many preachers or even many believers come to an understanding that we as 21st century believers who have the New Testament have nothing to do with the Old Testament because it contains the Mosaic law, the ceremonial laws and all that. So it has nothing to do with us. But is that how we ought to approach the Bible? Let us learn what is the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament and how even the Old Testament is important to us through this video.
As told already, there is this misconception and misbelief that the New Testament believers, the 21st century believers do not need the Old Testament. But how are we supposed to understand this kind of a belief? How are we supposed to look at this kind of a misconception that exists today? There are many people who preach it, who understand this way that they do not need the Old Testament. Let's look carefully at the scripture itself, the New Testament in particular, and then let's try to understand what does the scripture say about the Old Testament. Jesus in his teachings, he said that he did not come to abolish the law but rather to fulfill it. And when we look at the New Testament as a whole, we have 4,000 plus references of the Old Testament in it. And in particular, if we look at Romans chapter 9, 10 and 11, we see that these three chapters consist of the richness of the Old Testament in it. There are at least 100 plus allusions of the Old Testament that is found only in these three chapters. So overall, if we look at the writings of the New Testament, it is actually the explanations or the understandings of the Old Testament scripture passages. So the New Testament itself consists a lot of the Old Testament passages or the allusions. And Paul, when he writes to Timothy, he says all scripture is God breathed. When he says all scripture, he is actually referring to the Old Testament books. And now we should understand that Jesus and his disciples and the New Testament believers, all of these people, they looked as scripture the Old Testament books. They read the Old Testament books. They meditated on the Old Testament books. Jesus, for example, he went into synagogue, he read the book of Isaiah and he preached, he explained those verses from those books. So it is very, very important for us to notice that the New Testament believers or Jesus and the disciples, they never ignored the Old Testament, but rather they read it, they understood it and they preached it. So for us, we are not supposed to avoid the Old Testament. There are certain things that we are supposed to follow, and Old Testament still speak with us even today.
Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises and the prophecies that God made to Israel and through him to all the nations. And so the Old Testament is also valid and applicable to us today. In fact, it serves as the base for understanding the New Testament, without which the New Testament cannot be understood and the value of New Testament cannot be explicitly realized. But there are things which are discontinued, like the ceremonial laws and the sacrifice that Jesus himself made, because now Jesus was the sacrifice, there was no requirement of the sacrifices. So that is discontinued, but in the core essence of the teaching of the Old Testament is still applicable to us today, and it serves as a base to understand the holiness of God, the righteousness of God. So let us take the Old Testament as valuable as the New Testament, because that's where we can understand the Bible completely and the God of the Bible completely. Thank you for watching. God bless you all.